There's no better time machine than sports. I was in fourth grade, 9 years old, when Julio Jones first came into the NFL. And despite me just getting into football at that age, I watched a lot of him when he was at Alabama. And I didn't know a lot about football then, but I did know one thing, that Julio Jones was a freaking alien. You talk about somebody that looked like he was built off creative player on Madden. That was Julio Jones. He was everything that you wanted in a prototypical wide receiver one. Incredible size, 6'3", 220 pounds, but a monster after the catch. And if you were a starting cornerback in the league, there was not a single wide receiver that you didn't want to line up against more than Julio Jones, because this brother was just simply unstoppable in his prime. Monster after the catch. He can moss you winning 50-50 balls. In terms of where Julio Jones ranks all time, he's a top 5 wide receiver in my opinion. He's up there with Jerry Rice, Calvin Johnson, Randy Moss, and Antonio Brown. That's about it. And during the 2010s, you were always getting into debates in the lunchroom about who was better, him or Antonio Brown. Not so much Calvin Johnson, because Calvin Johnson, once you got into the 2010s, his career didn't last as long as what you would have thought of. So then it only became Julio versus Antonio Brown. Now, I personally feel like it's a tie between the two. I don't really have a preference of who was better. I am a Steelers fan, so I do kind of lean Antonio Brown, but Julio Jones was a monster in his own right. You can't really go wrong with either one of you. Have to pick between the two. They both were two of the most dominant receivers of my generation growing up, becoming a fan of football. And a moment that I would never forget was when I drafted Julio Jones in 2016 with my first pick in my fantasy football league with my homies. And he ended up having like 50 or 60 points when he went up against the Carolina Panthers. He had like 300 yards receiving. Julio Jones' nickname should have been Nightmare, because that's what he was as a wide receiver. You see Julio Jones lining up against you, why would you even want to think of trying to tackle that? Trying to tackle Julio Jones like trying to tackle a freight train in the open field. And although Julio Jones bounced around a lot during the telling of his career, he got traded from Atlanta to Tennessee, then bounced from Tampa Bay to Philadelphia. I don't really remember those stints. I'm always going to remember Julio Jones as the Atlanta Falcon when it's all said and done. And I'm waiting for the Falcons to sign him on a one-day contract. It's only right that the greatest player in the history of the Atlanta Falcons retires at the place where it all started. And some Falcons fans will push back on that. Some will say that Mike Vick or Matt Ryan is the greatest Falcon of all time. But Julio Jones is one of the greatest to ever play his position. And if you're one of the all-time greats at your position, you automatically qualify for being one of the greatest players for the history of said franchise. And when I think of the Falcons, Julio Jones is the first player that comes to mind. He was just so iconic, wearing that Atlanta Falcons uniform, putting on that number 11. He had one of the greatest catches in Super Bowl history against the New England Patriots. He had an incredible catch in that game that got overshadowed because they went on to choke that 28-3 lead, and Julian Edelman also had an all-time great catch in that game as well. But Julio Jones, it's just such a tragedy that he accomplished everything that there is to accomplish, playing the game of football, national champion at Alabama, multiple time Pro Bowler, first team All-Pro in the NFL, future first ballot Hall of Fame without a doubt. But the only thing that he doesn't have is that illustrious Super Bowl ring. And it kind of just leaves a sour taste in my mouth, because you would have loved to see Julio Jones have that hardware on his finger for how great of a career he had. And ultimately, Julio Jones, when it's all said and done, I don't see how he doesn't end up being a first ballot Hall of Famer. When it comes to wide receiver play of the 2010s, it doesn't get any better than Julio Jones. Like I said, you can't go wrong with either him or Mr. Big Chest. They were both just as dominant. They were like 1A, 1B. But Julio Jones was just so much of a headache to handle for opposing defenses because you automatically had to double team him. You weren't going to leave him in one-on-one coverage unless you had a guy like a Chris Harris Jr. or Darrell Revis on him. And even then, he was a handful for some of the best cornerbacks in the game. Julio Jones was just one of those all-time great players that you knew from his first snap playing at Alabama. How many players have you seen start their freshman seasons for Nick Saban? Not too many. That right there showed you how special this guy truly was. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, Julio Jones is already in the Hall of Fame right now. You don't need to wait 4 or 5 years down the road for the nominations to come in. He already is in the Hall of Fame. I don't get why we drag out some of these Hall of Fame inductions. For guys like Tom Brady, as soon as he retires, he should be in the Hall of Fame. Same thing with Julio Jones. And I almost shed a tear watching his retirement video because the older I get and I start to see these players enter the league and they start to retire, the more I start to feel like I'm nearing unk status. I can tell some of the younger generation wasn't really hip to some of these guys like a Julio Jones and whatnot, because I saw some people in the comment section trying to say, oh, how he ended his last 3 years kind of taints his legacy. No, the hell it doesn't. For certain players, with how dominant Julio Jones was throughout his career with the Falcons, you don't even care about, how bad it ended. All you do is remember the great moments. And 3 years of him not really being that good doesn't taint what was, one of the best careers that we've seen from a wide receiver in the history of this league. And just to have to live with the realization that Julio Jones has been officially retired. I know he's been out of the league for some time pretty much, but it just hits different.